My girlfriend said while watching sunset in Santorini. I think I need to explore who I am alone. I smiled, paid the hotel bill, continued my trip without changing plans, and over time she heard stories about where that journey eventually took me. I think I need to explore who I am alone. Those were her exact words. She said them while the Santorini sun was dissolving into the Aegean Sea, turning the whole sky into something that looked less like nature and more like a painting someone had left unfinished. She said them while I was holding 2 glasses of local wine, one in each hand, because she had asked me to grab them from the waiter 30 seconds earlier. I stood there, both glasses still extended toward her, the cold condensation from the wine running slowly down my fingers and dripping off my knuckles. I looked at her face. Then I looked at the sunset. Then I looked back at her. And I smiled. Not the hollow kind. Not the brittle, trembling smile of a man who has just had the floor ripped from underneath him. A real one. Quiet. Calm. Almost peaceful, if I'm being honest. I held out her glass anyway. She took it, and her eyes narrowed slightly, the way they did whenever she was trying to read me and couldn't quite land on a page. "Did you hear what I just said?" she asked. "I heard you," I said, and I meant every syllable of that. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Let me give you some context, but not much, because the context isn't really the point of this story. I was 29. She was 27. Her name was Claire, and we had been together for 3 years and 4 months, which I know sounds precise, but when you spend that long building something with someone, you tend to remember the math of it. We had planned this trip together for almost 8 months. Santorini was her idea, her dream destination, the place she had saved on her phone's travel folder for years before she even met me. I had booked the hotels, arranged the ferry connections between islands, built the entire itinerary from scratch because she told me, and I quote, "I want to go, but I hate planning, so you handle it, and I'll just show up excited." Which she did. For the first 4 days, she absolutely showed up excited. The 5th day was different. I noticed it at breakfast. She was quiet in a way that wasn't restful. It was the kind of quiet that has weight to it, like something heavy sitting just below the surface of the water, not visible yet, but you can feel the pressure changing. I asked her if she was okay. She said she was fine. I asked her if she wanted to change the plan for the day. She said no, the plan was fine. Everything was fine, which meant nothing was fine. But I had been with Claire long enough to know that when she got like this, pushing directly into it only made her push back harder. So I gave her space. We walked through the blue-domed streets of OIA in relative silence. I took photographs of things that caught my eye. She walked beside me with her hands in the pockets of her linen trousers, looking at things without really seeing them. And then, at the famous sunset point, surrounded by about 200 tourists all jostling for the same angle, she said it. I think I need to explore who I am alone. Here is what I did not do. I did not ask her what she meant. I did not say, "What about us?" Or "Where is this coming from?" Or "Can we talk about this?" I did not get angry. I did not get quiet in a cold, punishing way. I did not make a scene. What I did was stand next to her for a few more minutes, drink my wine, watch the sun finish its performance, and then gently take her empty glass when she was done. We walked back to our hotel. And in the morning, I sat down at the small desk in our room while she was still asleep, opened my laptop, and made 2 bookings. The first was a single occupancy room at a small boutique hotel on the island of Naxos, where we had been scheduled to spend the next 3 nights together. The second was a single train ticket for the following week from Athens to Thessaloniki, a leg of the trip I had been quietly looking forward to for months. I did not cancel anything. I did not modify the shared bookings we had already made. I did not change the return flight, because we had booked separate seats on separate returns anyway, hers leaving 2 days before mine because she had to get back to her job at the design agency. I simply adjusted for one person. My person. When she woke up, she looked at me sitting at the desk with my coffee and asked what I was doing. I told her I was handling some logistics. She sat up slowly and tucked her hair behind her ear, and I could see her preparing herself for a conversation she had clearly been rehearsing. "About last night," she started. "It's okay," I said. She blinked. "I mean, I want to talk about it," she said. "Sure," I said, and I turned my chair to face her. What followed was about 40 minutes of conversation, and I'm going to be honest with you. Very little of it surprised me. She talked about feeling like she had lost herself. She talked about how she had gone from one relationship to another since she was 19 and had never really had time to be just her, without someone else's needs shaping her days. She talked about how she loved me, but wasn't sure if she loved herself right now, and how she had been reading about the importance of solitude and self-discovery, and how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back from something good to find out if it's really right. I listened to all of it. I nodded where nodding was appropriate. I did not interrupt. And when she was done, I said something that I think genuinely threw her. I said, "I think you're probably right." She stared at me for a long moment. "You're not going to fight for us?" she asked. And I want to pause here, because that question is one of the most revealing things a person can say in this kind of moment. Because what she was really asking was, are you going to make this decision feel consequential by reacting to it? Are you going to beg and cry and negotiate and prove through your desperation that this relationship has value? Are you going to perform the role of the man who cannot function without me? I looked at her steadily and I said, "Fighting for us implies that you're something I need to defeat to keep. You're not a battle, Claire. You made a decision about your own life. That's yours to make." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "So that's it," she said finally. "That's what?" I asked. "You're just okay with this." "I didn't say I was okay with it," I said. "I think you're right that you need this. Those aren't the same thing." She was quiet for a while after that. We checked out together the next morning. The hotel staff, a cheerful young man named Petros who had clearly seen 1,000 iterations of this particular scene, managed to keep his expression professionally neutral as he processed our separate payments. I paid for my portion of the stay. She paid for hers. And then we stood outside on the stone steps with our luggage and the sun already warm on our faces, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not guilty exactly, not sad exactly, more like she had been expecting a storm and instead found clear sky, and the clear sky somehow felt stranger and more unsettling than the storm would have. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Naxos first," I said. "Then Athens. Then north. I'll figure some of it out as I go." She nodded slowly. "And you're not going to?" "I don't know. Come home early." I picked up my bag. "No," I said simply. "I'm on vacation." And I walked toward the ferry terminal. I did not look back. Not because I was performing some dramatic exit. Simply because, in that moment, I had nothing left to turn back for. Naxos was extraordinary. I know people talk about Santorini as the jewel of the Greek islands, but they say that mostly because they've seen the photographs and the photographs are genuinely spectacular. Naxos is different. Naxos has this quality of being entirely unbothered by your admiration of it. It's the older, quieter sibling who doesn't need the attention. I stayed in a small room in a converted house near the old Venetian tower, run by a woman in her 60s named Eleni, who brought fresh bread to a basket outside my door every morning without ever discussing it or making it a thing. It was just there. Every day, still warm. I spent 3 days wandering. I hiked to the Temple of Demeter in the morning and sat with a notebook at a cliffside cafe in the afternoons. I ate grilled octopus at a restaurant where the owner knew every customer by name within 2 visits. I swam in the sea for the first time in years without worrying about anyone else's sunburn, or whether we were staying too long, or whether the other person was bored. I was not performing enjoyment. I was simply enjoying. And somewhere in the middle of the second afternoon, while I was sitting on a low stone wall watching a fishing boat make its slow way back to the harbor, I noticed something. I felt fine. Not numb. Not suppressing anything. Genuinely, cleanly fine. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I was not fine immediately. That first night in my single room, I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about the 8 months of planning. I thought about the specific evening in December when she had leaned across the kitchen table and shown me pictures of Santorini on her phone and said, "Can we actually do this next summer?" I thought about the way her face had looked when the ferry first came around the headland and the white buildings came into view, and she grabbed my arm and said, "It's real. It's actually real." I thought about 3 years. 3 years is not nothing. 3 years is inside jokes and knowing how someone takes their coffee and understanding the specific texture of their silences. 3 years is the first time you really fight and the first time you forgive someone for something that genuinely hurt you. 3 years is choosing someone repeatedly, out of habit and also out of something more than habit. So I lay there and I felt all of that. I let it sit on my chest and be heavy. And then, somewhere around midnight, with the sound of the Aegean just audible through the open window, the weight shifted. Not disappeared. Shifted. Like it had found a place to settle that wasn't directly on top of my lungs. And I slept. Athens was a different kind of trip entirely. I had been there before, briefly, for a conference 3 years earlier, and I had spent the whole time either in the conference center or in the hotel feeling vaguely regretful about not being able to explore. This time I had 5 days and nowhere specific to be. I climbed the Acropolis on a Tuesday morning, just before the main tourist crowds arrived, when the light was still horizontal and gold and the marble caught it in a way that made everything look like a stage set. I spent an afternoon in the National Archaeological Museum getting genuinely, deeply absorbed in things I had only seen in textbooks. I found a neighborhood called Exarchia that nobody on my original itinerary had mentioned, full of murals and small bookshops and cafes, where the coffee was cheap and the conversations were loud, and the energy had this particular feeling of a place that doesn't quite behave the way cities are supposed to. I liked it immediately. I went back 3 more times. On my second visit to a small cafe there, I ended up in a long conversation with a man named Oliver, a British documentary filmmaker who was in Athens researching a project about modern mythology. He was compact and precise in the way he spoke, chose his words like he was editing in real time, and had this habit of making observations that seemed slightly obvious when he said them, and then turned out to be genuinely profound if you thought about them for more than 30 seconds. We talked for almost 4 hours. About his project, about stories and how people use them, about the difference between the life you plan and the life you end up inhabiting. He was the first person I told about Claire. Not the whole story, just the shape of it. He listened, nodded, and said, "The people who need to leave often need you to be devastated when they do. It confirms something for them about their own importance. When you're not, it throws everything off balance. It makes them recalibrate." I thought about that for a long time after. Thessaloniki was a revelation. I know people say that about cities all the time, but I mean it in a specific way. Thessaloniki felt like a city that had figured out something that other cities were still arguing about. The food was better than anywhere I had eaten in years. The waterfront promenade had this unhurried quality, like time moved differently there, slightly slower, slightly more generous. I had booked a room in a small hotel near the old city walls, and the owner was a man named Costas who in another life might have been a stand-up comedian, and in this one was a hotelier who treated every check-in like a performance and every guest like a returning friend. I ended up staying 2 extra days beyond what I had planned. Not because of Costas, though he was a significant reason. Because of a walking tour I took on my second morning, led by a woman named Petra who had grown up in the city and had the kind of relationship with its history that you only develop when a place is genuinely yours. She talked about the city's layers: Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, Jewish, Greek, modern. She talked about how Thessaloniki had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times and had always come back slightly different, slightly changed, but still fundamentally itself. "The city doesn't mourn what it was," she said at one point, standing in front of a Byzantine church that had been a mosque and before that a pagan temple. "It just keeps being what it is now." I wrote that down in my notebook. Here is where the story takes a turn that I wasn't entirely expecting. About 3 weeks after Santorini, I was back home, back at work, back in my apartment, which, for the record, was always mine alone. We had never officially moved in together, though she had kept a drawer and a spare key and had spent enough consecutive nights there that the distinction sometimes felt academic. The drawer was still there. The key was still hanging on the small hook by my front door. I didn't move either of them. I got back into my routine, which was not a particularly glamorous routine, but it was mine and it had a good rhythm to it. I worked as a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm, and I was in the middle of a project I genuinely cared about, which helped. I cooked more than I usually did. I read 3 books in a month, which was more than I had read in the previous 6 months combined. I went back to a gym I had lapsed from. I started going to a local weekend market and buying vegetables. I had to look up how to cook, which sounds small, but turned out to be consistently satisfying. And I was, recognizably, doing okay. Not performing okay. Not the aggressive, performative okayness of someone trying to prove something to an imaginary audience. Just actually, quietly, getting on with it. Claire reached out for the first time about 6 weeks after Santorini. A text message. Just, "Hey, hope the rest of the trip was good." I read it and thought about it for a moment. I wrote back, "It was great, actually. Hope you're well." And that was the end of that exchange. She texted again 2 weeks later. This time it was a longer message. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said she was seeing a therapist, which she mentioned in a way that felt like it was supposed to carry some weight. She said she missed me sometimes. She said she hoped we could maybe get coffee and catch up. I sat with that message for about a day, and then I replied, "I'm glad you're doing the work. Genuinely. I don't think coffee is a good idea right now, but I wish you well. She sent a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. I don't know what the thumbs up meant. I suspected it meant she had been expecting something different and was recalibrating, which is the word Oliver the filmmaker had used. A mutual friend of ours, a man named Felix who I had actually been friends with first and who Claire had met through me, called me one evening about 2 months after everything. Felix was one of those people who always had an opinion and was generally not shy about sharing it, which was sometimes annoying and sometimes the most useful thing in the world depending on what you needed in a given moment. He told me he had run into Claire at a party. He said she seemed off. Not broken, he clarified quickly, more like she had arrived at some destination she thought she wanted and was quietly confused about why the arrival didn't feel better. He said she had asked about me. He said she specifically asked if I had been upset. And he said, with the specific delight of someone who has witnessed something genuinely interesting, that when he told her I seemed to be doing well, she looked like someone had told her the weather in a country she had planned to visit was better than expected when she had packed for rain. I laughed at that. Felix laughed too. She expected you to fall apart, he said. I know, I said. Did you? The first night, I said honestly. And then I went to Naxos and ate grilled octopus and watched a fishing boat and felt something settle. Felix was quiet for a moment. Good, he said simply. The project at work picked up significantly in the autumn. I was given the lead engineering role on a coastal infrastructure project, which was the kind of work I had been quietly angling toward for a couple of years. It involved a decent amount of travel. Site visits up north, coordination meetings in other cities, 2 trips to consult on similar projects in different countries. It was demanding in the way that good work is demanding. It takes a lot from you, but it gives you something back. I was good at it. I already knew I was good at it. But there's a difference between knowing something about yourself in theory and having it confirmed in practice by real results and by the specific look people give you when they realize the person in the room who had the answer was you. That difference matters. Felix, who worked in the same broad industry and had enough professional overlap with me that we sometimes crossed paths in work settings, mentioned to me at some point that word was getting around. That I was the person on this particular kind of project. That firms were talking. That my name had come up in a context where names don't usually come up unless someone is paying real attention. I filed all of this away with quiet satisfaction and kept working. Claire texted again in November. This time the message was longer and more direct. She said she had made a mistake. She said the thing she had been calling self-discovery had started to feel more like self-sabotage the more time passed. She said therapy had helped her understand some things about herself, about patterns she kept repeating, about the way she tended to reframe dissatisfaction as the other person's fault or as a structural problem in the relationship rather than looking honestly at her own role in it. She said she missed us. Not in a vague way, she said, but in specific ways. She missed the way I planned things. She missed how I cooked on Sunday mornings. She missed the steadiness of me, which was a word I turned over a few times because I had never thought of steadiness as something particularly magnetic, but the way she described it made it sound like the thing she had been most careless with. She asked if we could meet. I read the message twice. Then I put my phone face down on the desk and made myself a cup of tea and stood by the window for a while. I want to tell you what I was feeling in that moment, because I think it matters. I was not unmoved. I want to be very clear about that. 3 years is not nothing. I had loved Claire genuinely and concretely. Not the abstract kind of love that exists mostly in your idea of a person. The real kind. The kind that shows up in small gestures and shared silences and the way you automatically make 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. Reading her message, something in me recognized her. Recognized the specific shape of her honesty in it. Because when Claire was actually honest, when she stopped performing and just said the real thing, she had a directness that was almost startling. The message was honest. I could feel that. But feeling that something is honest is not the same thing as knowing what to do with it. I thought about Oliver in Athens. About the way he had said, when you're not devastated, it throws everything off balance. It makes them recalibrate. And I thought, this is the recalibration. Not a manipulation, not a game, just the natural movement of someone who has had time and distance and honesty and arrived somewhere different from where they started. I thought about Petra in Thessaloniki, about the city that doesn't mourn what it was. It just keeps being what it is now. I replied to Claire's message. I told her I appreciated her honesty. I told her that the work she was doing on herself sounded real and meaningful, and I was glad she was doing it. And I told her that I wasn't in the same place she had left me. Not worse. Different. I told her that the version of me who had stood on those steps in Santorini with 2 glasses of wine had gone somewhere while she was doing her self-discovery, and the person who had come back wasn't quite the same configuration. I told her I didn't say this to be cruel. I said it because she deserved an honest answer instead of a convenient one. She took 3 days to reply. When she did, she said, "I think I already knew that." And then she asked, with what I could feel was genuine curiosity rather than a lingering argument, "Where did you go?" I mean, not literally. I know literally. Felix talks. Where did you actually go? I thought about how to answer that for a long time. What I eventually wrote back was something like this. I told her that I had spent most of my life being reliable in a way that I had confused with being present. I showed up to things. I was dependable. I planned and organized and made sure things worked. But I had been doing it in a kind of autopilot state where I was executing a version of myself rather than actually inhabiting one. I told her that when she said what she said in Santorini, the first thing I felt, under the shock of it, was something that I was ashamed to recognize as relief. Not relief that we were over. Relief that I was being handed a moment that required me to make a genuine, unmediated choice about my own life. Most people in that moment would have tried to fix it, would have performed the grief necessary to keep the status quo intact, would have begged or reasoned or promised things. And the reason I didn't is because something in me understood, very clearly in that moment, that what she was describing was not just about her. It was a mirror. She was looking for herself. And when she held up that mirror, I realized I had not been looking for myself either. I had been maintaining a version of myself that functioned well, but didn't particularly grow. And Santorini, and Naxos, and Athens, and Thessaloniki, and the months after, they were not just me recovering from a breakup. They were me actually, for possibly the first time in a long time, paying attention to my own life. Her reply to that was, "I didn't think you saw it that way." And I said, "I know. That's part of why we didn't work." We talked for a few more exchanges after that. Civil, honest, the kind of conversation that is only possible when neither person needs anything from the other anymore. She told me about some of what therapy had uncovered. A pattern of choosing partners who were stable and capable and then eventually resenting them for those very qualities, because she interpreted their stability as evidence that they didn't need her, and she had deep, old anxieties about being needed. I told her I had probably made that worse by being so self-contained, by never letting her see the maintenance work happening underneath the surface, by presenting a version of myself that didn't seem to require anything, which was not the same as a version that didn't need anything. We were both, I think, arriving at honesty a little past the point where it could change the outcome. But there was something clean about it anyway. Felix called me after she apparently told him we had talked. He asked how I felt. I thought about it honestly. Like I closed a door properly, I said. Not slammed. Just closed it. He said that sounded healthy. I said it didn't happen on its own. He asked what I meant. I told him about those first weeks. About lying on the bed in Naxos staring at the ceiling. About the weight that sat on my chest that first night. About letting it sit there instead of immediately doing something to make it stop. About how sometimes the thing that looks like strength from the outside, the not falling apart, the continued trip, the paid hotel bill, the smile, is actually just a choice. A choice to not perform your pain for someone else's comfort. A choice to let the thing be what it is. A choice, very simply, to keep going. Felix was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing," he said eventually. "No," I said. "It's not." The coastal project came through in the spring. The full contract, which was significantly larger than what we had initially scoped, and which came with a level of professional visibility that I had been working toward for years. My director called me into his office on a Thursday morning and told me the client had specifically requested me by name for the next phase. That doesn't happen often. It happens when someone has noticed, in a way that goes past politeness, the specific quality of your work. I shook his hand. I walked back to my desk, and I sat there for a moment and let it matter to me, properly, without immediately moving on to the next thing. That felt important. I don't know exactly how word got back to Claire. I suspect Felix, who is genuinely not a gossip, but also cannot help being enthusiastic when something good happens to someone he cares about. Or it may have been through professional channels. Our industries overlapped in places. She worked in design. I worked in construction and infrastructure, and certain projects are visible enough that people hear about them through ordinary professional osmosis. She sent me a short message. Just, "I heard about the project. That's a big deal. Congratulations." I replied, "Thank you. It's a good one." She said, "You always were going to get there." I think I knew that. I read that line a few times. I thought about what it meant. I thought about how people often recognize something in you that they fail to properly value until the moment arrives where they can observe it from a distance. I didn't reply to that part. I just said, I hope things are good with you. She said they were getting better. I believed her. In the summer after, about 14 months from the evening on the Santorini cliff, I went back to Greece. Not Santorini. I wasn't avoiding it out of some dramatic symbolic gesture. I just didn't feel a particular pull toward it. Instead, I went to the Peloponnese, a part of Greece I had never been to, and I drove rental car roads through dry, ancient landscapes, past olive groves and Byzantine ruins and small towns where the afternoon light turned the stone walls a color that looked almost edible. I stayed in a house outside Monemvasia that a friend of Oliver's, he had stayed in touch, occasionally, in the way that good chance encounters sometimes continue past their moment, had recommended. The house had a garden with a fig tree and a view of the sea. I stayed there for 10 days. I worked in the mornings on some designs I was developing. I walked in the afternoons. I cooked in the evenings. I read on the porch until it got dark. And on one of those evenings, watching the light leave the water in a way that reminded me, unavoidably, of that original sunset, I thought about the moment on the cliff. I thought about holding those 2 glasses of wine. I thought about smiling. I thought about how different it could have gone. How I could have argued, or pleaded, or negotiated, or collapsed. How I could have flown home the next morning and spent the next 3 months trying to rebuild something that one person had already decided to walk away from. How I could have made her the center of gravity around which everything else orbited. But I hadn't. I had paid my half of the hotel. I had continued the trip. I had gone to Naxos and Athens and Thessaloniki and kept going. And what I understood now, with enough distance to see it properly, was that the smile on that cliff had not been a performance of dignity. It had not been a carefully calculated response designed to make her regret the decision. It had not been indifference dressed up as equanimity. It had been something more basic than any of that. It had been the moment I recognized, at some level below conscious thought, that my life was still mine. That a relationship ending did not mean that I ended. That I was not the supporting character in someone else's story. That the trip continued. That the trip always continued. I'm telling you this story because I think we have a tendency, in moments of loss, to treat our grief as the appropriate and proportional proof of our love. Like if we don't fall apart, we must not have cared enough. Like the depth of the pain is the metric by which the relationship is measured. And there is something true in that. Pain is not nothing. Loss is not nothing. That first night in Naxos mattered. It had to happen. But there is a difference between feeling grief and performing it. There is a difference between honoring what something meant to you and burning yourself down in its service. The smile on the cliff was not me being cold. It was not me being unaffected. It was me understanding, in some inarticulate pre-verbal way, that the only person whose response to this moment I could control was my own. And that my response was going to be, simply, okay, what's next? I have not gotten back together with Claire. This is not one of those stories. She is, from what I understand through occasional mutual contact, doing well. Genuinely well. She has done real work on herself. She made some significant professional moves. She seems more settled in herself than she was, which is, when I think about it honestly, probably what she actually needed. Not to come back to me, just to find whatever it was she said she was looking for that evening on the cliff. I hope she found it. I mean that without a trace of irony. What I found was harder to describe, but easier to live in. A project I care about. A routine I actually inhabit rather than execute. A clearer sense of what I want my work to be, what I want my days to feel like, what I'm willing to trade, and what I'm not. A few new friendships. Oliver, Petra, some people from the Coastal Project team who turned out to be genuinely good company. A fig tree in a garden in the Peloponnese that I have thought about more times than I can explain. A version of myself that feels, for the first time in a while, like it fits. The stories got back to her gradually. The project. The professional recognition. The second trip. Felix, who is constitutionally incapable of not being enthusiastic, probably helped with the transmission of most of it. She heard them the way you hear things about someone whose life has continued past the moment you last saw it, through the slightly distorted, slightly delayed channel of mutual contact and social osmosis. And I'm told, by a reliable source who does not trade in cruelty, and so I believe her, that when Claire heard about the trip to the Peloponnese, the project, the way things had developed, she said something like, I always knew he'd be fine. That was never the part one worried about. Which I found, when I heard it, to be a genuinely interesting sentence. Because what it told me was that some part of her, the real, honest part underneath the self-discovery narrative, had always known. Had always known that if she walked away, I would not wait on the steps, would not change my plans, would pay the bill, pick up the bag, and keep going. She had always known. She just needed to see it confirmed. And maybe that confirmation was what she needed most. Not to come back, not to undo anything, just to know that the person she had loved was the person she had thought he was. I have stood at a lot of sunsets since that evening in Santorini. Different seas, different angles of light, different company, or none at all. And I have never once regretted not turning around on those steps. Not because the relationship didn't matter. It did. But because there is something in how you handle the moment when someone chooses to walk away that tells you more about yourself than almost any other moment I can think of. You can make yourself small in service of keeping them. You can rage against the unfairness of it. You can perform a devastation so complete that it becomes a kind of currency. See how much you matter, measured in how badly I am broken. Or you can hold both glasses of wine. Hand her one. Watch the sun finish what it started. And in the morning, quietly make the adjustments for one. Naxos is still there. The fishing boats still come back in the late afternoon. The old woman still puts bread in the basket by the door without ever making it a conversation. The light still finds the temple at that particular angle in the early morning. Athens still has neighborhoods that don't behave the way cities are supposed to. Thessaloniki still moves slightly slower, slightly more generous than anywhere I've been before. The Peloponnese still has its dry roads and its fig trees and its view of the sea. And I still have my bag. Packed or ready to be packed, depending on the day. Because the trip continues. It always continues. That much, I know now. That much is mine. If this story found you at a moment where you needed it, you already know what it was trying to say.